So just to start off, just introduce yourself and explain who you are.
My name is Ed Skloot. I was the first executive director and then CEO president of the Surdna Foundation, and I arrived on the scene in 1989.
So we have a list of questions, but you came prepared with some things you wanted to say. Do you want to just start?
Well, not really, except a beginning. So, I mean, I think you were asking the other, my colleagues or ex-colleagues, how they got here and what. And I was thinking there is one story which may be of note or of use, which was that I was working in my own consulting outfit for several years before this possibility came around. And I had wanted to work for the Surdna Foundation for at least 2 years before anybody knew there was such a thing, a job, or even the foundation itself. And it's kind of an intricate story, so I'll spare too many details. But I happened to have, the way I found out about Surdna was that there was only one person working here half-time. And there were no published guidelines and no annual reports, and so it was pretty much below the waterline as a foundation went. And but I had heard of it because periodically, in working in consulting, I was trying to get grants for help clients of mine find grant money one place or another. And I always got a polite response from Surdna when the phone was answered, but I never could find out anything more about it. In any event, we'll fast forward. I was giving a talk in Louisville, Kentucky about nonprofits being social entrepreneurs. That term was not in use at that point, but I was edging toward it with a few other people in the field. And there was a man in the audience, an older man named Bemis, Sandy Bemis, who was the retired owner head of the Bemis Paper Company, based in Minnesota. And so Sandy and I started talking after the event, and he said, well, could you maybe do some work with the Minnesota Symphony? I'm on the board. And I said, well, I'm not sure that's my game, but sure, I'd love to talk about it. He said, well, I'm in Minnesota. And I said, where in Minneapolis? Do you know a guy named John Andrus? And he looks at me and he says, John? He says, of course I know John. He works in the office next door to me. Bong. So I said, Sandy, would you mind if I sent him a letter and you hand delivered it? He said, I'd be delighted, Ed. It'd be a pleasure to do it. So I wrote a letter to John Andrus 2 years before I got hired. And John, and I sent it to Sandy, and Sandy called me up the following week. I remember this obviously very well. And Sandy says, hi, Ed, how are you? And we had a little chat, and he said, Ed, I just want to mention one thing to you. I said, sure, Sandy, what is it? He says, you've got a typo in your letter, and John Andrus just hates typos. Would you mind writing it again? I said, absolutely, no problem. So I rewrote it. I sent it back to Sandy. Sandy gives it to John Andrus. John Andrus takes the resume and a letter, and he puts some note on the type like, save for future use, or something like that. And then as we move forward many months, they begin a search for a executive director of the Surdna Foundation. And John got the first batch of resumes, and it tells a lot about John more than me or anything. And he looked through them and he said, wasn't there a guy named Skloot? I got a letter from him a long time ago. Put him in the pack. I want to see how he stacks up. So they rediscovered a resume for me and stuck it back in the pile. And John went through it and he said, I'd like to meet this guy. And one thing led to another, and lo and behold, some months later, I got hired. There are 3 or 4 other lightning strikes, like the ones I've told you, pure accidents and serendipitous things. that one thing or another ended with my sitting in the chair as the executive director. And so it was a long process, this is another piece, that the board went through. It was thinking about professionalizing and hiring a professional director for easily 4 or 5 years before they actually did hire someone. And there are other stories to relate about that, but I won't do it right now. There is one other piece of the story I wanted to mention to you, which was when it came down to the finals of choosing the first executive director, and it was pretty clear it was going to be me. John Andrus asked if I would come out to Minneapolis and have lunch with him and sort of have the final handshake before we proceeded down the road. So I did, and I flew out to Minneapolis, and we were going to have lunch in the Minneapolis Club, and we got there, and he was there, and we sat down, and it was Minneapolis Club, so one of us had tomato juice and one of us had shrimp cocktail. Those were the two prime orders for an appetizer or whatever. And somewhere along the line, John looks up and says to me, and when he would sometimes want to say something very particular, he'd rise up a few inches in his chair and he'd sort of drop his chin a bit and he'd say, Ed? Ed? I said, what is it, Mr. Andrews? He said, I just want you to know something that might be of interest. You weren't our first choice. And the bottom fell out. I mean, why am I here? And I went and felt for my airplane ticket and see if I still had it. So, okay, we kept on going a little bit, and then John said, Ed, let me tell you something else. I said, well, what is it, John? He said, you weren't even our second choice. All right, now I'm really bagged and scared and don't know what's going to happen next. So a few more minutes go by, he says, Ed, I suppose you'd want to know why we hired you. I said, yes, Mr. Andrus, I definitely would. And he said, we decided we wanted to hire someone who we had to tell to slow down than to hire somebody else who we had to say, speed up. And in that one sentence, essentially, I got a very straight and clear message from John Andrus, which I took to be, we've got to move well into the 20th century here, and we've got to move reasonably quickly. But this is a family, and we have our own network and culture and everything else. Don't mess it up. So go at a good clip, but look out, and you'll be fine. Those were very important words, and I, to this day, still remember them, and I certainly remember the incident. I don't remember the shrimp cocktail. That was the story.
Can you back up a little bit and talk about why were you interested in, why did you send that initial letter years before?
Oh, well, I sent the letter originally because I had heard about Surdna. I had been working in nonprofit consulting for 9 years. I set up my own organization to do this consulting, and I was pooped. Hunting for dollars day after day really can wear you out. And we had gotten to a very good point and had a nice name in the trade, et cetera, but I knew my days were numbered because I just couldn't keep it. We were always wondering about the next paycheck, and it was always like many small nonprofits cobbling for your life. And so what's more common and more usual than thinking, if I have to beg for it all the time, I could also give it away. And from that kernel of an idea, which probably 30 million Americans have, I began to look up places in New York and New York area that might have some opportunity that I might, land on. And one thing led to another, and this came about. I should tell you, by the way, that the board was pretty much of an amateur at this game. The board had never hired anybody before to work for them, really, certainly not full time. I had never worked for a family or for a foundation before. So neither of us really knew what exactly this job could be or would be. There were very few touch points along the road. it sort of came to a cute little head when I think it was Sam Thorpe, who was sort of shepherding the process, said, well, what do you want to make? Or something like that. And I said, I don't know. What do you want to offer? And Sam said, I'm not sure. How about benefits? If you got something in mind about health benefits and stuff? I said, no, I haven't given it a thought. I have no idea what do foundations usually do. I'm not privy to this information. And we went back and forth like this, not meanly, but it was like, two folks stumbling around together. And then Ray Foote was the fellow who was the headhunter from Hydrick and Struggles, and Ray said, gentlemen, excuse me, I think I can be helpful. So give me a couple of days and I'll come back with a written proposal for you both to look at and see if you agree with it. And Ray Foote did it, and he came back 2 days later, and not knowing what I was signing up for, I said sure, and I think Sam knew something, but he said sure, and that is the example of how we had not begun the process of creating an institution. There was, in fact, a family. Everybody knows that, and it was doing its work. But in terms of living in a more modern era, there were no forces on it to push it any place. And if you know about foundations, and many of you who are watching this do, you know that foundations don't have to do anything that they don't want to do, almost. And as a result, external forces can be very helpful. In this case, it was Ray Foote who did. When I got to Surdna, Mark will remember. Mark, by the way, as he said, was the first hire, and a glorious one at that. Mark had worked in the same building, actually, and he was actually also the person who did Surdna's audits. So who else to think of talking about, what do I need, Mark? And Mark was ready to tell me what I needed. Well, you didn't have to go very far to figure he's the guy. And quite quickly, Mark and I just pulled ourselves together and made a team out of what we had to do and went on from there. And it was, I think, a wonderful time and wonderful team. Let me go back to your question. What happened? Well, when I got here, there was no organization. We had a 2-room suite on Park Avenue and 48th Street, one private conference room and one open area where a secretary was. And in the back side of the building, and it always looked like 7 p.m. I mean, it was dark. And so we began to try to do our work. Mark may have mentioned that the grants that had been made over the years were put on index cards. There was we still have here in the place the box that all the index cards were in, and we still have those cards, noting who got it and when they got it and so on and so forth. I had an enormous opportunity to try to figure out with the board, what do you do next? And we were, again, I wish we had been more facile at doing what we did, but stumbling in a good direction, I think we made pretty good choices. One of the first things I did when I got here was put a hold on all grants for 9 months. And I said, all the money that's been promised will go out, but we are changing our guidelines. The board approved of this, of course. We had no guidelines. There were simply no guidelines. There was no clear mission of the organization and so forth. So we put a hold on everything. And my job over the next several months was to go around and visit all the board members, members of the family and board members, and talk with them about what they felt ought to be the role of the foundation in primarily the United States. Very few people had even suggested anything international, which was perfectly okay with me. We have plenty to do domestically. So I went around, put the hold on it, on those grants and talked with everyone. And even though things sort of seemed simple, they weren't. For example, the first and most important area, I remember this clearly, I remember a lot of things clearly, I'm surprising myself, was environment. Most of the folks who I had spoken with were very much into the environment. But once you cut below that title, you can go anywhere from preservation of cats and dogs all the way to global warming, had we known about it then, and we didn't. And so it's not that you can say, well, we do environment. It's like, what do you do in environment? And at that point, there were many, many different interests who were coming forth with, this is what I'd like to do, and this is what I'd like to do. And the second area, because we had decided there would be two to begin, had to do with family. This is an organization, and this is a family that believes very strongly in its culture, its ties, and was very well aware that it was somewhat below the waterline. Very few people knew who or what it was. It never had any public activity of note. It was named backwards, as everybody knows. The Andrews family became Surdna, and in some cute circles it became the Backward Foundation. John E. III even mentioned that in his going away party that we had when he retired from the chairmanship. So I went around talking with a lot of people trying to figure out what do we do and how. I felt very comfortable in being able to thread through the concepts of environment one way or another. But I didn't feel as comfortable with family. Again, it can mean a huge amount to a lot of people. And as a result, I had to just take shots at what it was. And I think the only time that I was, I wouldn't say manipulative, but I would definitely say straight on this one, was I felt a tilt toward, let's call it, for the sake of just discussion, a junior league approach to things. Take care of mothers and babies who need help and so forth. And my training and experience before that was rather more gritty. And one of the things I wanted to do, as has been said, I brought through quite a number of people who were experts in their fields to have them reveal what they were doing and why. And one of the people who came through and spoke with the board was Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, who everybody had heard of, but nobody had met. I had known Marian a little bit. And I remember a dinner that we had. She had to catch the last shuttle back to Washington. And Marian, if you know her, likes to talk in data. She has horror stories to back up the data. But 73% of the people who were born in Minnesota, and she will just go on and on. By the time Marian finished her opening lines, which ran easily 10 or 15 minutes, I think most of us, including me, were pretty scared about what was the real picture of what was needed in the States. And I personally say from that moment on, we began as a group, possibly me pushing a little harder than I should have, to look more at, what are the real issues here that we can buy into, and let's not be too easygoing if we can. The result was we found a way to look at family matters through community matters. So in the conversation about family and families and children, I think I leaned more heavily, I know I did, toward the idea of let's look at whole communities and let's see how families operate and can be supported within a community setting, as opposed to providing feeding programs or foster care or tutoring. I really believed then it was one of the brighter ideas I had and is still being fought over in the field, that comprehensive approaches to deep-seated problems are the only way you can really start to get a handle on things. Otherwise, fixing any one or two things among 10 or 12 won't get you anywhere. And so we moved into community revitalization, rebuilding communities and community areas. One of our great victories was in rebuilding part of the South Bronx with a number of other foundations, it's one that someday will be told. It has been told a bit. Still, we didn't go frontally into families and kids. We went through it in another direction and I think landed well because of a slightly different way of thinking.
I have to say, Ed, I didn't know that story. The things, CR starting the family. It's completely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Well,
The thread is still, I mean, this question, how do you express the familyness of the foundation? That's really, really interesting.
yeah, well, there was a point later on, 5-8 years later. Sorry.
No, just to look at me.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was a point some years later where the board was really getting tired of it. The Bronx was still burning. Blah blah blah. We couldn't, at least, point to too many huge victories at all. And there was a time when I came to believe that working largely with a national organization that had been formed, which is now called Living Cities, which is still around and doing good work, and some other things, was wearing thin. And after about 10 years or so, it became clear to me, and this probably bumps up a little bit into what Hooper may have said, or Mark, or Phil, that became one of the touch points to go further in bringing program areas together. By the time we got to 5 program areas, probably about 12 or 14 years after I came to Surdna, I also came to the view that it wouldn't make a difference in a real sense if we slimmed the programs down to 2 or even 1. Even though different board members had different preferences for what they would like and felt strongly toward. And I could say I was agnostic about which they might choose. My point is that we began to see ourselves in an era where leveraging your money and putting as much bang for the buck into the game was important, was more than important. It would make you as a foundation, and it would make the field as a whole better in the process. And so it could have been arts, it could have been community development or community revitalization, it could have been environment. I would have been happy with any of them, personally. I never took this idea further in an overt sense, because once we are on a path like this, it would be very, very difficult to make major shifts. Though we had begun to move community revitalization and environment closer together, doing more urban work, doing more engagement of the two, with a little bit of arts thrown in, a little bit of community development put in there as well, it needed a new person in the chair. And it needed another conversation, and it needed me out of the room to begin to really formally bring programs together in ways that could be synergistic. I don't think, I think I might have been able to do it, but I don't think I would have been the right person to do it. And it's one of the several reasons why I felt like this run that I had had, which was 18 years, it was spectacular, and met some kind of a record among directors of family foundations, I believe. Those who were there longer were probably not breathing, but I was. And in any event, by the time it came time for me to leave, it was very clear we were heading toward that place, and that some others could do that certainly as well or better than me. And so it was one of the thoughts in my mind as I prepared to move on. Well, that's a good question. I think they heard it, so I won't repeat it. But how does a new executive director, who doesn't really know what foundations are like anyway, I came from the other side of the street. The first phone call I got, actually the second phone call I got, when there was a full column story in the New York Times about my appointment to this foundation that nobody had ever heard of before. It was bizarre, almost. And one of the reasons was that where did this thing come from? And all of a sudden, this newish but quite old foundation appears. So you work your way. You try to figure out, how do you dance on the dance floor? And sometimes we did good dancing, and sometimes we hit some, some bumps on the dance floor. On balance, I think it was a great dance. It was a great dance card, actually. But you figure out things you can't do. You figure out, like, it was clear to me in the early years that high levels of publicity and PR for the Surdna Foundation was a no-no. This humility side, this quietness side, this due diligence side of the family was very strong. And a number of them really didn't want, they were and would have been very, very proud if we had never issued an annual report again. This was at that time. Everybody shifts and changes, so I'm not saying that that's the case at all now. And I, again, remember very much one of the incidents that changed that, and that perspective. And it was about 5 or 6 years in, and we had terrific results, or getting them at CCRP, this program in helping to rebuild the South Bronx. And we got Jimmy Carter to come up and pay his first visit to the time he went the first time and saw nothing but rubble. There were a lot of small hits and big hits. But one of the board members, I will say who it was, as I remember, it was Larry Griffith, Dr. Griffith, said something on the order of, in the board meeting, "This is really terrific. Why don't people know more about this?" And Larry was one of the folks who I think was very much on the side of, let's keep it low, don't make waves, et cetera, et cetera. And Larry, I think, to his credit, in my view, began to see that a public face of a foundation is as good as money in the bank. If you are totally anonymous, you will remain it, and you will have very little muscle power in the field itself. You can't take leadership. You can't do a whole lot of things. If you speak out, nobody cares. In this particular example, I'm using in one of several, the board began to see that selectively done and well done, we had reports to publish, talks to give, meetings to be at, and so forth, where the programs that we were doing really deserved to be put out in the public domain. And as a result, we gradually became better known. I'd say, just to follow on with this theme, another thing that I was very aware of is, and I was deep in my bones, moderately jealous. If I, in the first 5, 6 years or whatever, I'm using that as a rough number, would call somebody and say, "I'm Ed Skloot, and I'm the executive director of the Surdna Foundation. I want to talk to you about so-and-so," not a small number of times would someone either fob me off to someone in the foundation that could do nothing, or I might even hear an occasional click on the other side of the phone. With almost exactly the same endowment size, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, headed now by Stephen Heinz, before that by Colin Campbell, they could call anyone, anytime, any place, including the White House, and because it was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, people would always return the call. And I must say, from the early times, I was exceptionally jealous of that. And one of my minor but important goals was that when I called somebody on the phone and said it's Ed Skloot or Mark Devenoge from the Surdna Foundation, the call would be responded to well and respectfully. And indeed, by year 5, 6, 7, 8, I think we had reached and then topped that point. So competition works in a lot of different ways.
I'm wondering if there are any other questions about
I think it would be great, Ed, when you were here, you coined maybe you didn't coin it, but we will say you coined the term beyond the money.
Oh, yeah.
I would love to have you just talk a little bit about that concept because it sort of is the style
Yeah.
of the work.
Well, thanks for asking that. In fact, as we became better at our trade, don't forget, Mark was here with the investment committee. We went from $292 million endowment when I got here to $1 billion when I left. And we had given away $450 million in the process. We were doing very, very well indeed. And it was very, very clear from a number of experiences that just dropping a grant for 1 year, 2 years, and as you may know, the average size grant in philanthropy is a year, sometimes a little bit less. The average grant or the median grant is $30,000. Most money is pretty small. And we began to see, Hooper was certainly part of this, Robert Sherman was part of this. It's clear, most of us were, that we could do a great deal more. Here's one anecdote. I remember Paul Gorman, who ran the National Partnership for, I'm forgetting the name, it was an organization to work, National Religious Partnership for the Environment, NRPE. And Paul came in and he sat down and I had known him briefly, and he said, I would love to do a strategic plan to create this organization that links religious organizations and environmentalism. In fact, there was none at the time. And I thought this was a wonderful idea. Who knew how it would develop? And Paul said, well, and I'd really like to have, if I could, $100,000 in a large planning grant that we could get and maybe go after that more. And I looked at Mark, and we're going to get to beyond the money in a minute. I looked at Paul and I said, that's not enough money. What are you, joking? You want to build a national or international organization? Paul, get real. How's $500,000 to start? I'm not sure we gave $500,000, but we gave quite a bit more than $100,000. And we continue to support him and his organization. And we continued to see that it wasn't just the money. If we provided consultant help, if we provided assistance from other organizations, if we made house calls, which I think was truly important, we would go to colleague foundations and say to them, either on the phone or personally, hey, Group ABC is phenomenal. Take a look at them. We could see that instead of having one tool, which was a check in the mail, we might have 8 or 10 tools that could be used at different times in different places, including, by the way, not just showcasing a grantee, but having an analog to a venture capital approach where 3 or 4 grantees would come in together and make a pitch to a larger number of funders. That happened later in the time that we were here. That credit goes to Vince Staley, who was on the staff at the time, and Vince saw the importance of bringing people together as a group and having the bouncing off one another work really well. So I would say that the bottom line of this was beyond the money really became a touchstone of things that we wanted to do. And every one of our program staff people was able to go on the stump, was able to talk in the affinity groups that we were members of, and to make a difference in terms of what we felt and what we believed and how we could help them get to where they wanted to go. It had a very powerful impact, and more it's just become, the lay of the land. Everybody does it now. Done?
No, but is there anything that you can think of that maybe we forgot to ask you about what would be important as the centennial is being approached?
Well, I don't know. I had all my notes over there, but let me just say that, are we still on or are we off or we're on? Okay. Let me just say that I think that my time here was fortuitous for me and was fortuitous for the board. We moved from being a hermetic, not well-known, passive organization to one that was respected, helped make things happen in the field, and the term of art that was used a lot when we were here was punching above our weight. We almost never were not at a table where the big boys were, or the big girls, but most of them at the time were big boys. And that enabled us to get our piece of the action, just as Mark was talking about how we were able to get better deals than would normally come if we were small and didn't make the effort. So I think that at the time, finally, the board was ready to take some big steps. They had no idea what they were getting into. I had no idea what I was getting into, and we had no idea what we were getting into. And as a result, I mean, we made our way together. I think the years that John E. III was the board chair were just fabulous. We had, I just can't say enough. I mean, he was a great man and was the anchor in the best of senses for this foundation. Now that Phil is here, now that we have a larger and newer staff doing more things, I think we've gone into another phase of the growth and development of Surdna, which is equally or more important. Let's just say we took it from startup into mezzanine. And Mark, and Phil and all the rest of the program staff are now running hard at another level, all to the credit of the board, who stuck with me, who stuck with the staff, who stuck with their own ethic and their own culture, and with little rough edges, as everybody always has. I think by the end, we were in great shape.
I have to ask one more question, and then I think we should open it for the group interviews here.
Sure.
So, just in terms of the values, the core values that existed before you started, how
Right.
do you see your work here and how it preserve those values? Has there been a through line?
Well, there are a number of ways. One of the more obvious ones is the creation of the Andrews Family Fund, which I'm sure you have already discussed with other board members and family members. The culture of a family giving back was not overt here when I came. In fact, it was virtually non-existent when I came, but it was a tinder ready to be sparked. And over the first decade I was here, more and more as board members got deeper into the fields of their own interests, they began to see how this culture could be worked out deeper into the family, broader to other families, though somewhat less, and their culture and ethical principles I was always aware of. And I felt, although probably I didn't hit the mark all the time, I felt that that was exceptionally important. Sometimes I get up in the morning and I say, it all sounded like Ed, and it wasn't them. I think if there was any real fear I walked through, it was that, all the time. I've come to think now that, yes, in a way it was all Ed. No, I don't want to go that far. It was a lot Ed. But I don't think I ever spoke once in my own behalf. I always spoke on behalf of the Surdna Foundation and where it was and where it was going. So I feel that I was true to this foundation very much. I can say honestly that there was no self-aggrandizement on my part, and much as I'm prone to blame myself for things, and I think 2 or 3 times about it, on this one I've concluded that the regard for the family and where it came from and what it was trying to do was exceptionally important in the success that we have had and will continue to have.